Okay, welcome to week 10. This week we're going to hear part 2 of the UK party system and party politics, governance, ideology and policy, and we are hearing, as last week, from Professor Patrick Dunleavy of the Department of Government. Patrick.
Thanks very much, Tony. Well, this week we are moving off voting and on to thinking about ideas, really, and just pop my phone somewhere else, and governance. So we're thinking about a party system, and last week we discussed how parties behave, how voters behave, and what are the electoral institutions, particularly the electoral system, plurality rule, how that has tended historically to favour Conservatives and Labour. But this week I want to think about other kinds of governing institutions that have tended to support the old two-party politics system in its day. So I'll start off with that. And I think you need to go back really quite a long way to understand what those institutions have been and how continuingly important they are to this day, in certain specific areas anyway. Secondly, I want to talk about party ideologies and cleavages. Thirdly, I want to discuss how parties recruit elites and how they behave in opposition and in office. And fourthly, think about parties and public policy, where the story has actually been that parties are less and less important in public policy for a number of reasons. And then I want to go on and talk about coalition government. So here are the propositions that I think are worth thinking about, and these are things that are eminently debatable, and you may want to debate with me about. So the first one is that historically Britain has had very strong nationalised competition. Now that's quite problematic because we don't have anything like the presidency in the USA, which is a single office that can only be won by one person or one party at a time. So what is it that we have that's somehow equivalent to that, or was equivalent to that for many, many decades? And that's the interesting thing. And my answer is really there are three particular factors. The first was the thing that people in Britain have tended to forget about and erase from their historical memory, namely that Britain was for a long time an imperial state, and imperial states are always slightly schizophrenic states. The USA is now, and we used to be in the heyday of our empire. And that schizophrenia produces a particular concentration on secure and stable government, for reasons that we'll discuss. Secondly, there's the whole problem that we have of parliamentarianism, as the late lamented Ralph Miliband used to call it, the whole cult of Parliament, really. Parliament isn't just a museum, although it is a museum, but it's also a living sort of legislature where everybody's grown up inside that museum and believes strongly in a certain culture. And of course that's based on the electoral system. It's an extension of the electoral system. It's a way of disguising the limits of the electoral system. And also central state in power in Britain has tended to be strong. So those are the first, that's why we have, those are the factors that have historically made it look as if we had something like a unifying office, like a presidency, and produced two-party emphasis. Party ideologies in Britain are now fragmenting, but we'll see also that in some ways they're sort of pivoting. They're not necessarily getting less coherent, but they're just sort of changing shape. Parties are very key now still in terms of who gets to be in government, who gets to be recruited into the elite. But increasingly the problem for parties is that they are recruiting only amongst themselves, and operating only for themselves, or at least voters see them increasingly as operating only for themselves. So they represent a tiny slice of people in British politics, but not the wider voters. Fourthly, we've had a club ethos of competition or collusion almost between the Conservative and Labour parties. And that's very strong, and in some ways you can think about the coalition government as a very interesting bid by the Liberal Democrats to get into the club at huge cost to themselves, but still. Fifthly, parties are less and less important actually to policy making for the three reasons I mentioned here. The first is that social life is becoming more specialised. The second is that actually most public policy competition now is a cognitive competition. It's a competition of knowledge and ideas between rival advocacy coalitions, and these don't usually fit very neatly with party lines. And thirdly, the media and the social media are doing more of the job, so we can all, in a way, contribute to policy making a lot more quickly and a lot more easily using social media than even, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. And then at the end, I want to try and discuss in a bit more detail the whole thing around the formation of the coalition government in 2010. Now, you might think, well, that was then, this is now. But, May 2015, in many ways, looks as if it's going to be a rerun of 2010 in terms of being a hung parliament, but different in certain key ways. So I think it's very, very helpful if you want to predict the future or go down to Paddy Power and lay a bet or do anything really next year, to have a real think about the coalition formation process and how much it was a continuity with and how much it was a difference from the past. So those are the 6 key propositions. Now let's just think about the empire. In the old days, we used to have a British state that was like this. We had an apex, which was the cabinet and Whitehall. And in the apex, we had, all the central decision makers, the Winston Churchills, the Lloyd Georges, the Lord Salisburys, everybody from your history books. And particularly in the period from, let's say, the early 19th century through to the 1950s. The thing about this state that was unusual compared with what we have now is that there were really 2 completely different states operating through the same decision makers using much the same machinery. There was a domestic island state which was progressively becoming more liberal democratic. It wasn't liberal democratic for much of the 19th century. Even by 1914, 40% of men didn't have the vote and no women had the vote. So it was still a democracy that was being built, and it also began to build a welfare state and so on. So that was a very liberal, responsive, constitutional, and moderately operated welfare maximizing state. At the same time, the same decision makers were running the British Empire. And the British Empire was something of a direct contradiction to this island state, because it was, at its peak, it had 400 million people who didn't have the vote. Mainly people of a different ethnicity from us. So the white dominions got the vote, but all the non-white dominions didn't get the vote. And what they got was despotic government. Now you may say, but it was very liberal and it was very British and it was orientated towards the good of the people being governed. Well, we can have an argument about this, but the important point is that the citizens being governed didn't have any real control over what was happening to them. It was a very top-down state. So we had this whole imperial defence apparatus, we had this whole apparatus of colonial government. Most of the money raised in these overseas colonies was spent on one function, or 2 functions. One was law and order, and the other was providing for the military defence of the colony involved. Very, very little was spent over decades, really, on health or education or anything developmental, really. And in some ways, this was a sort of a contract, because the British Empire for much of this time was actually a very weak body. It didn't quite have enough manpower, and didn't have enough capital, and didn't have enough defence funding to really sustain this apparatus that had been created and acquired. So that meant it was a very stressful thing to govern. There were always dangers, there was always trouble popping up here and there, troops having to be moved, colonies having to be re-pacified, and so on. And essentially, you have a very schizophrenic system of government. So it's liberal at home, and it's not liberal overseas, especially in the colonies. And it's sort of a little bit ambiguous in relation to the white dominions. So that actually is typical of other European countries for much of this time, certainly of France. Even the Dutch had a quite substantial overseas empire, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Germans briefly. So it's a sort of scarring that's actually present in a lot of European countries. And it creates a kind of secretive, double standards sort of way of operating. And in particular, it creates a sense of, we've got to keep the whole thing going. We mustn't endanger the realm. We've got the whole of this imperial setup, and therefore there's got to be strong and secure government. And tended to produce a focusing on the two main parties, particularly in the late 19th century, when the Irish, at various points in time, were dissenting from imperial rule and threatening to hold the balance of power. And that's really why, towards the end of the 19th century, the Conservative and Liberal parties and their leaderships colluded with each other to remove many of the powers of Parliament by small-scale things like changing the standing orders of the House of Commons. For example, a rule was introduced into the House of Commons that said that no MP can propose even a £1 increase in public spending unless they have a certificate signed by a minister. That is still, to this day, a key part of the budgetary control system for the UK. But it's not contained in any of the budget rules. It's contained in the Common Standing Orders, and it was deliberately designed to prevent the Irish having any real influence, because ministers could always not sign their certificates. And that became the foundation of a very strong control of Parliament by the executive. And you needed to control Parliament because you were running this really big empire. You couldn't afford to have dangerous destabilization. Well, what happened to that system? It shrank and shrank and shrank. Even by the 1980s, we still had a few colonies like Hong Kong and so on. But it shrank and became, the island state became the general rule. And then, since 1973, Britain has lost a lot of strategic power and capabilities to the European Union. And we've had two little islands of the old regime that remain. One is nuclear deterrence, which was a desperate bid by Conservative and Labour governments in the post-war period to try and maintain Britain's influence in the world, even when the empire was shrinking away. And even that has now shrunk to very small proportions. And the main still big gap where we still have this kind of schizophrenic attitude is in the secret state, the intelligence state, particularly the operations of GCHQ, which is a very powerful agency, doing a lot of things in alliance with the National Security Agency in the USA. So that remains a powerful bit of what we do that is not democratically supervised. For example, we have one committee of Parliament, the Intelligence Security Committee, chaired by, it consists of people, I think almost everybody's in their 60s, and they're all trustees who've done, some job with the security services and been positively vetted. And they produce reports every now and again saying, we've looked at all this stuff about GCHQ spying on everybody indiscriminately, and we can assure you there's no need to worry, you know. Everything's under control, and these are never really debated in Parliament, and they're not voted on, and so on. Recently, the Home Affairs Select Committee has started trying to intervene, but until that, there's been no real parliamentary overview. And of course, the budget for the secret state is not published, and so on. So, you know, all the normal kinds of rules that used to apply to the empire still apply to the secret state. So the thing is, that's a very powerful, long-lived history. It's a whole set of attitudes which have shaped the way British elites have operated for years and years, and then, in many ways, often unquestioningly. For example, it always used to be a great thing that you had to have a British government formed very, very quickly. You couldn't let even a day go by without forming a government. These continentals who spent 3 months, you know, putting together a government and having caretaker prime ministers and things like that, that was absolutely not something that the British could ever even tolerate, couldn't contemplate that. Until suddenly in 2010, the Cabinet Secretary wrote a memo saying, actually, I think you could probably take your time to form a coalition. And everybody accepted that. And we duly took a week after the election to form a coalition. And the sky didn't fall, the stock market didn't collapse. All the predicted terrors failed to materialise.
Mr. Heath's piano was wheeled out, wasn't it? That was the thing. The pianos were moved into the street after when the Prime Minister lost almost immediately, and the cat and everything pushed out.
Yes, you had to throw the Prime Minister out and get the new one
immediately to make it.
Yeah, because it was the old imperial fetish, really. Anyway, so that whole thing has gone away. Parliamentarianism remains. This is the ideology of the House of Commons. The House of Commons is full of 646 MPs. They're actually quite minor public figures in modern British life, most of them. But you know, they're living in this beautiful museum with the Pugian architecture and everything, and they're treated with great deference by everybody inside the parliamentary chamber, but not anywhere else in the world. And that creates a kind of... Well, you know, I always advise our interns who are going to work for MPs that really British MPs are amongst the touchiest people in the world. You know, any sort of impinging on their role in life, and they get very, very touchy. And there's been this whole theory of Parliament is sovereign and Parliament is supreme. Actually, the Parliament has been, you know, pretty well run by the executive for the best part of 100 years. And the only really serious policy decision that I can think of where Parliament has exercised its own mind and has made up its own mind, and MPs have made up their own mind, occurred last autumn when MPs for the first time declined to intervene in Syria at the behest of the Prime Minister and the government, and expressed a lot of scepticism about the reasons, the foreign policy reasons that the government had put to them. And that decision actually then changed the whole British government policy. It then went and changed the whole of the US government policy and changed the international outcome. So it's one of the most important votes that the British Parliament has had for 100 years, I think. So we've had this artificial pattern in the Commons. We do the elections, lots of people vote for lots of parties, then don't get represented. The Tories and the Labour Party come back. They're radically overrepresented. They then dominate the whole procedure of the Commons and the whole government and opposition. And there's a swapping round of these roles so that they, you know, if you're the opposition this time, you accept a lot of government predominance in order to be the government next time. So there's been a kind of a whole ideology of Parliament is very supreme, and at the same time Parliament has been quite trivial in many ways until the advent of the coalition government in 2010. So that's been quite a hard thing to argue against and see past. Britain has also, until very recent, until 1997, Britain was probably the second most centralised liberal democratic state in the world. The only one that's more centralised still and bigger than us, of course, is Japan. And even to this day, England remains amazingly undifferentiated. We haven't really got any regional government in Britain. In England, you've got 55 million people being governed as a single administrative unit. You know, outside of Japan, you can't really point to any other country that is so strong. It goes along with a system of very strong civil service, Whitehall predominance. Every single piece of legislation that's been passed by British governments for the last umpteen years has a Henry VIII clause in it, which basically says, and if the Secretary of State feels like doing it, he can do whatever he likes. And this is written into every piece of legislation, and it's sometimes needed, as we see. So, for example, when government intervenes in tower hamlets, or when it takes over academies that have been penetrated by Islamic... allegedly penetrated by Islamic extremists. This is all under these reserve powers which are written into virtually every piece of legislation. So I think Tony Blair is the person who really, and his government takes the credit for historically making a change in this. Actually, if you look at Tony Blair's autobiography, it's a sad thing that all the good things he's done in government and for the British Constitution, he thinks were a mistake. He goes, you know, oh, I had to do this awful thing with the Scots, you know, and then the Welsh, and then London. As for that Freedom of Information Act, how I hated it, you know. Everything good he's done, he rubbishes in his own autobiography and pretends somebody else forced him to do it. And all the bad things he did, he's still arguing, are correct. So it's a strange book to read. But anyway, he did make the change, and that's been a fundamental change. Of course, it's been unravelling and changing more and more since then. And we discussed how their party system's already changed. So let's just think about the other big thing which is centralised in Britain, which is the party ideologies, you know, the dominance of a single sort of left-right way of looking at the world has been very strong in British politics from about the middle of the 19th century when it began to form through till quite recently. Now, up until recently, we could say that the parties have become more managerialist. I think just recently we're beginning to see a redefinition of the ideology space in British politics. So by managerialism, I think we can, you know, just sit and think what might be in, let's say, the Conservative Party manifesto for next time, or what was in it last time. If we think last time, in 2010, really it's quite hard to think what were the things that made the Conservative position a sort of right-wing position. So they were in favour of more public spending cuts than Labour, and they were in favour of, I don't know, teaching phonics to students in nursery school who are age 3 or 4 or 5 or something. Not quite sure why that's a right-wing thing. And then they were in favour of nuclear weapons. Again, I'm not quite sure why that is a right-wing thing, and so on. So they're rather eclectic, really, British parties. But the underlying left-right cleavage is still strong. Now, back a few years from now, Paul Webb from the University of Sussex, who's very good on the British party system, was trying in his textbook to think about kind of a two-dimensional representation of party politics. So he's got the left-right, well, he calls it socialism, but I don't think any British party has advocated socialism for quite a long time, versus capitalism. And he has a group of, you know, 3 different sort of left positions and much more coherent right positions. And then the second dimension he discussed was a dimension that people have been talking about in Britain since the 1960s, which is really between people who are in favour of liberty at one end and people who are more in favour of authority at the other end. So you could, for example, at the last general election, Labour was still defending the idea of a national ID card and rather extensive surveillance of everybody that went along with that, whereas the Conservatives were more in the libertarian front, and when they got into power, along with the Liberals, they got rid of the national ID card scheme because it was seen as potentially interfering with human rights. So, I mean, that's been an area of relevance for British party ideologies for quite a long time, but I don't think it's the most important second dimension that you would point to now. And this is the one that comes from the British election study. It's rather a strange diagram where they invited a whole bunch of experts, including me, to place parties on a left-right scale, and then to place them on the vertical scale here is, is the party in favour of European integration or is it in favour of national independence? So you can see that they have UKIP down here at the bottom, very right-wing, and very strongly in favour of national independence. The Conservatives quite close. And then all the other parties they've got in a group up there, Labour, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP and Plaid Cymru, in a sort of moderate position in between, but slightly towards European integration. So this is an expert assessment in the sense that you get together 50 people and you ask them this thing, they're reasonably well-informed people, and then the mean that you get, you can give it some credence or not. Tony is looking very dubious.
I just want to tell you something about the people that you ask in the survey as well. I'm just
yes.
guessing. I mean, anyway.
Also, it's very interesting that when the British election study wrote to me about this, they didn't ask any questions about the Greens. So I wrote back and then I had a big Twitter correspondence with them about why weren't they doing the Greens, and they were going, oh, Greens, yeah, sort of. Forgotten about them, really, was the answer. Anyway, I think if we could just sort of push this a little bit and put it into, to believe in European integration or national independence, I think is not really a very good dimension. So just take the same information and I've just twitched it round a bit. So I think it's, it's better to think about, should we stay in the EU and keep reasonably open borders? That's really the one end of the second dimension. Or should we leave the EU and close our borders and cut immigration? That's really the other end of the scale. I don't think it's just about the EU. The point about the EU is that as long as you're in the EU, Latvians and Lithuanians can come and take our plumbers' jobs, whereas if we can only leave the EU, they will all be exiled to the outer darkness, and we can get back to Britain in the 1950s, which is really where UKIP would like to be. So I think we can think about the parties in these terms, and we can think about their relative sizes, and we can also think about where are the leaders located inside these parties, because of course parties scan a big range of positions. Where are the leaders located? And I've sort of put a little white dot where I think the leaders are. So this is basically the same as the British election thing, but I think it's more adjusted, and I have put the Greens in there, and I think it's worth mentioning that the SNP could be an important factor at Westminster politics if they succeed in winning 20 seats, say. They'll have as many seats as possibly the Liberal Democrats, and so be just as important for coalition formation in that eventuality. Well,
Plaid Cymru.
Plaid Cymru, they're not on there, but they'll be very small compared to that. We could also just mention some problems about how do you locate where parties stand and so on. So there's an important view associated with Matthew Goodwin and Rob Ford, which says that actually UKIP voters are not very right-wing. The party is very right-wing. The positions that the leaders take are very right-wing, but actually UKIP voters are sort of in the middle. They're quite prone to have leftist views about public spending and other things. And in that sense, the Goodwin forward view is that UKIP is closer, if you like, to Labour and therefore more of a problem for Labour. However, the surveys all show, and the latest British election study thing, which was announced at a press conference today, showed that really most of the defectors to UKIP have come from the Conservatives. But anyway, there's deciding where people are in ideology space is quite difficult to do, and we don't really know how to do it. But we do know that if we move to Scotland, there is a second really different dimension, which is about should Scotland stay in the UK or should it leave and be independent? And the SNP and the Scottish Greens are solidly there in the left and in favour of independence. Interestingly here, we see a main line of action down towards the right, but Labour is I think in a strange position, because it's not. In 1997 it was up here, but just recently, if you look at the Labour submission to the Smith Commission, it was incredibly centralising still. So they seem to be, in a strange position, which one could predict would be bad for them electorally, and they really need to get up towards the diagonal. And both of these things, I think you can see there's a kind of pivoting of one dimension. So it's not a left-right thing, it's just down here. It's pivoted, but there is still basically an underlying kind of polarity, a single main line of competition. Then we have a few things like the Greens and the Liberal Democrats who are sitting off the line, but it's fairly unidimensional. And similarly, that you could see what the main dimension is. It's normally in the past Labour would have been in here, and then we'd have said it's just a pivoted thing, but just at the moment it seems to be in a strange position. Okay, so moving very swiftly on, let's just run through 2 or 3 other quick things that influence parties. There's a very interesting argument by Katz and Mayer, which I guess everybody needs to read, which says, we look at the development of party systems since the late 19th century, they've gone through 4 characteristic phases. In the first phase, parties are just local elites and regional elites who gather together and then support a national leadership. And so they're aristocratic, or they're run by notables and so on. Certainly in the mid-19th century, not a bad characterization of the Conservative and Labour parties. And they only mobilized voters very sporadically at election time, often by giving them large amounts of food and drink to do what they wanted them to do. Then later on, as you enlarge the electorate, you move to a mass party system, and you get the development of rather all-embracing, overarching party organizations that had youth movements and trade union movements and women's movements, young conservatives and all that kind of stuff. And they sort of engaged a lot of voters' time and attention, and they were very important to the way people felt emotionally about political life and so forth. And they were largely based in Europe either on class, especially social democratic versus conservative things, or around ethnic lines of division like language and religion, which in the UK have been, well, religion has been a factor in British party mobilisation, but nothing very major. And then in the post-war period, we moved into more modern liberal democratic times. Parties broadened out. They could no longer sustain these large mass membership organisations. People weren't interested in having a kind of politicised take on every aspect of their life. Trade unions and the Labour Party weakened. People could get their dates without going to Young Conservatives and so on. So these sort of withered on the vine and, have continued to wither to this day. So party membership really well down from the millions that were there in the 1950s to maybe 120,000 for the Conservatives and pretty much the same for Labour. Meanwhile, the Scottish National Party has managed to rack up 100,000 members in the course of their referendum campaign. So, you know, quite small party machines, leaders who then were trying to appeal to lots of different social groups, not just to one, and so on. And then the final cats and mare stage is when parties begin to get subsidies from the state for, you know, you got X million votes last time, we'll give you so many million for your party apparatus, for your leader's office in the House of Commons, and so on. So party organizations just become really part of the state, and they reach out and engage a minimum number of voters, especially at election time, but also in terms of filling councillor positions and sustaining a kind of political recruitment ladder. But essentially, we've sort of almost come full circle back to the cadre party. We've got an elite-run party. Nowadays, we can say that, you know, quite a lot of MPs are sons and daughters of previous MPs. Quite a lot of MPs' assistants at the House of Commons are family members and so on. So it's become a sort of political cartel, that's the argument. You still have some, you know, external lines into these organisations. They're not completely closed, but they're not very open. They're not really representing anybody but themselves. 230 of our current MPs come from a single university course, the Politics and Philosophy and Economics course at Oxford University, which I did myself, and now we're setting up our own new LSE Politics, Philosophy and Economics course so we can have a rival with them. But basically this is a pretty closed, restrictive sort of recruitment network. So the cartel party thing really suggests that parties don't represent any more as they did in the mass party era. Well, we discussed in some ways last week the many factors that have tended to bind Conservative and Labour elites together. And, you know, particularly it's worth reminding you that if we just think about the disproportionality of British politics, this is the effective number of parties that people have voted for, and this is the effective number of parties that are represented in Parliament across British regions. Now, if that was going to be, a representative, you know, an accurate representation of what people have voted, we should expect to see a long cluster of dots on this line here. That would be the equal treatment dot, and the nearest we get is the southwest region. All the other regions of the country show either a Conservative or a Labour over-representation. And, you know, that produces a sort of way of running the House of Commons, which is in denial, really, about the poor representativeness of the institution, and particularly in association with the previously mentioned consensus around the empire and then the nuclear state and then the secret state, has tended to produce a kind of collusion to maintain Conservative and Labour common interests. And you can see that rather interestingly in things like there was a vote in 2009, I think, on the reform of the House of Lords, and 12 different schemes were put to the House of Commons, and some combination of Conservative and Labour MPs voted every one of these schemes down, all of the 12, so that no progress could be made. And we could see that again when the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives pledged to reform the House of Lords this time. Actually, Labour helped Conservative right-wingers to sabotage that reform again, because then there was a bonus for Ed Miliband in it, in terms of not reforming the constituencies. So this is what we call a kind of club ethos. It means that there's a common interest between the supposedly competing Conservative and Labour elites. Finally, we should think about how important parties are for policy making. And really, these three reasons are key reasons why they're not important anymore. Well, they're very selectively or partially important. The first thing is that modern social life has become more specialized. So all the different parts of social life, the legal system, the school system, the health system, these are not easily controlled from Westminster. It's, you can sometimes have a party that says, we believe every school child should learn phonics. Then you can introduce it, and after 4 or 5 years you realize that phonics doesn't really work, or at least it doesn't do the job that you think it is. So you've introduced it, you've had a lot of policy churn, you've had a lot of intervention by ministers, but it hasn't really changed the way the schools are operating, and so on. So the argument, which is particularly associated with people like Nicholas Luhmann, the German social theorist, is that increasingly the state can't control many of these areas. They're too specialist, and they're too separate, and they're too autonomous. Different spheres of social life are run by the people who run them. They can't really be controlled by political parties, even if the party, does a lot of collating of views and tries to have experts on different things. Secondly, most of the disputes that happen in British public life now are around cognitive issues. So they're mobilizing by people who are arguing for one point of view, one bit of knowledge over another. So let's just take an example. Should we stop parents smoking in cars if they've got children in the car? Now this is not something that you can say that people line up in different ways. Basically conservatives might tend to line up on the freedom of parents to smoke where they will. Maybe socialists might want to intervene because they believe in a nanny state or something. But actually it's a very detailed, specific issue. Should there be a law that says parents can't smoke with the kids in the car, or shouldn't there? And that's the kind of issue where lots of people pile in. So libertarian organizations pile in favor of parents smoking whatever they like. Tough luck on the kids. The GPs and the doctors pile in on parents being regulated and so on. So it's very hard for parties to take positions on these issues. And mostly they can't, and mostly they don't. So that most issues are not really resolved in that way. And finally, of course, media and social media play a really important role now, especially social media, because if a party says something stupid, let's say a member of the House of Lords says, the reason why the poor are poorly nourished is because they can't cook. Well, the sky's fallen on this person, and by lunchtime they've retracted and they're busily cooking in kitchens for the next year to make up for it. So, the basic problem is the surveillance of politicians is much stronger than it used to be. And they can't get away with poorly thought out policies. So they can control some things like the big budget, maybe the very gross outlines of the welfare state, defense issues where people really don't have expertise, but in many areas the role of the parties has gone. So that brings me on to, let's just think about 2010 coalition. How did that form? How does it operate? What can we think about, let's say, what's going to happen in 2015? And interesting thing, because this is the first peacetime coalition government. It's the first time the Liberal Democrats, as a party, recognisably different from, let's say, the Liberals in the 1930s, have been in government for half a century. And yet, it shows some sort of continuities. We've had a Liberal, Democrat and Conservative coalition operating now for 4.5 years. And actually, it hasn't operated all that differently, in many, many ways, from a normal single-party government.
Well, easier than Blair and Brown in some ways.
Yeah. Yes, certainly they've had fewer fights than Blair and Brown, and more public or understandable ones. Anyway, so the thing is, how did that actually happen? Well, let's just think about what the position of the parties was back in 2010. And of course, Europe was there, but it wasn't really strong. So I do think the second, I think Paul Webb had it right, that the sort of civil liberties versus illiberal position was pretty much the second dimension. And these are where the parties were sitting vaguely, and you can see where the leader positions are from the little white bobbles. So David Cameron is a pretty centrist conservative leader. Nick Clegg is a pretty right-wing Liberal Democrat leader, a little bit closer than we would normally be. And Labour, rather on the Liberal side, Gordon Brown, big clunking fist guy, not really well known for his defence of civil liberties. So perhaps Labour a little bit further from the Liberal Democrats and disagreeing over things like the ID card and so on. So the question is what coalitions could form given these numbers? And you needed to get to 323 seats in order to have a majority. Conservatives are just short. Labour is well short. Liberal Democrats with 57, so having a really big representation. So we could think about what are the three possible majority coalitions. The first one is a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. Now where would that sit? I mean, a good way to think about this is to think about the relative sizes of the parties. So the bigger the ball is, the more you can attract the coalition government to be close to you. So the fact is that the Conservatives were a much bigger party, 5 times bigger than the Liberal Democrats. They could be pretty sure that any coalition, under a thing called Gamson's Law, would give them a lot more ministerial position, a lot more policy control than could be given to the Liberal Democrats. And that would be a majority government, 363, perfectly comfortable. And they could do what they actually did do, which is immediately pass a law saying we'll have 5-year fixed-term parliaments, which protected the Liberal Democrats against the Conservatives suddenly calling a snap general election. The second coalition would have been a Labour Liberal Democrat government, but the interesting thing is that this would be, although Labour would again pull the Liberal Democrats a long way towards them because they still had 8 times more seats than the Liberal Democrats, nonetheless that wouldn't have had a majority. It was just 8 seats short of the majority, and it wouldn't have been able to offer a secure government, and so on. So what was the third and last coalition that was never ever considered? Well, not really a grand coalition, but a coalition between the Labour and the Conservatives. Why wasn't that considered? After all, this was a time of national crisis, according to both the main parties, the big austerity program having to be introduced. Meanwhile, in Greece, they were rioting in the streets and the currency was collapsing and so forth. So there was, but it was never considered, never on the cards. Why not? Well, perhaps it's because those too far apart, but a big reason is that because there would be 2 very evenly balanced parties, that would never be as good as allying with a smaller partner for either of the big parties. They would have had to sacrifice way too much. Perhaps when we've done coalition governments 10 times, Tory and Labour coalitions will begin to look feasible. After all, they've worked in Germany a couple of times.
In local government a bit.
They've sometimes worked in local government, yeah.
Very occasionally.
Yeah.
Would it be possible for the Lib Dems to have just remained independent and then chosen policies to back rather than having a coalition?
That would have been possible, but then it would have been likely, what's it called?
Pay and rations, is it? Something in supply.
Supply and support. Supply and support.
Confidence
support. So confidence and supply, that's what it's called. So the idea is basically if there's a vote of confidence, you prop up the government and you vote the budget through, but you don't necessarily agree about the individual legislation. I think that would have left them vulnerable because there could have been a snap general election, and whereas if they went into the coalition, they got this 5-year deal and they allegedly had influence on the government. So that's the basic setup. If we look at just at the details of the coalitions that were considered, and there's some very interesting literature on this, including a very interesting but I think rather self-delusive book by Lord Adonis about the Labour side of it called 5 Days in May. There was really only 2 possible majority coalitions, the one that formed and then a rather complicated coalition that had to include the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, Plaid Cymru and various other people. And Labour, I think, had very bad memories of 1979 when they failed to push through a devolution programme and these parties withdrew their support and Mrs. Thatcher won.
And they had lost the election.
Now, if we can think, well, why did the other things... Labour and the Liberal Democrats, that's what most voters expected might happen. Certainly most Liberal Democrat voters. But Labour had lost the election, Gordon Brown had resigned as leader, it wasn't clear who the new leader was going to be, etc., etc. And the single-party government, the Conservatives could have done that, but there'd probably been an election quite soon. Both the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats argued that they felt there was a need for a secure government. And finally, there could have been some kind of deal between the Conservatives and the Northern Irish Democratic Unionist Party, but that's tricky because Northern Ireland has got sectarian politics. You don't really want to involve that in the British government. So the coalition that formed was the coalition that formed. So what factors do we need to think about? Well, we need to think about what are the resources that parties have and what is their coalitional appeal. So it's worth thinking about that. The key resource, the absolutely key thing is, do you have enough MPs, or in coalition together, do you have enough MPs to form a government? You might want to think about the past record of government and total number of MPs. So really the only two parties who could form a government, who could commence forming a government, was either Labour or the Conservatives for those two reasons. Then you might want to think about reputation. The Liberal Democrats perhaps didn't want to link to Gordon Brown because he was seen as having been defeated and rejected and so on. Then you might think about the office costs of going into coalition. It's extremely unclear why the Labour Party in 2010 had done no planning at all for coalition negotiation. It's like there's this scene that I don't think you've ever seen it, the famous steamroller scene in Austin Powers, where he's driving a steamroller very, very slowly from one end of a warehouse to 500 yards down the track. There's a henchman of the opposition person. The henchman's going, no, no, no. He's got 10 minutes to get out of the way, but he doesn't, and eventually gets flattened. Why did the Labour Party behave like that? If you can explain that to me, you're a better person than I am. And then there's just logistics that you might want to think about. Meanwhile, in terms of your coalitional appeal, the first thing is, well, if I form a coalition with you, what will that coalition be able to do? Will I get majority support? Then there's this question of proximity that we've discussed. What are the costs of associating with you? The Liberal Democrats obviously felt that they would be able to survive the costs of associating with the Conservatives, and particularly survive the costs of agreeing to triple student fees after they'd campaigned in every seat in the country, saying that they would cut student fees. But actually that proved to be quite an important mistake. And then there might be common interests that you can both share. So it's a complicated picture, but the question is, how much of that picture do we really need to know in the 2010 case? In particular, if we just look at the vote shares of MPs that people had, the number of MPs, and then the power that they had, the coalitional attractiveness that they had, how does that look? Well, look, here's the full set of party vote shares, and this is like UK vote share, and this is the key resource thing, the how many MPs. You can see the Conservatives are tantalisingly just short of 51%. Labour's not close at 40%, and the Liberal Democrats a lot less, at just under 9% of MPs. So one way you can work out how attractive each of these parties is using a thing called power indices, which are sort of technical. If you look at the chapter on the reading list, it tells you how these are calculated. But basically, you can create a score, and this shows you what is the attractiveness of the party as a coalitional partner. It doesn't really show you the party's power, it just shows you how attractive it is. And if we take this score, this particular score, different scores would give you more or less the same result. You can see it says the Conservatives had 37% attractiveness. Labour and the Liberal Democrats, although Labour has got, more than 4 times as many MPs, resource share, key resource share is 4 times as big as the Liberal Democrats. Actually, in coalitional terms, they were only as attractive as the Liberal Democrats. That's what this index shows you. And it also shows you a kind of, you could think of it as thinking, well, how does that score compare with that score? If we put those two together, what would be the Conservative share? And the answer is 56%. So that actually suggests that you'd have a much more even-handed coalition than you in fact had. And what I argue in the paper, that I won't go into in great detail here, is that actually we really ought to not use these scores, but we ought to take an average of this and this, and that will give us a much better idea of overall power. If we do that, you can see the Conservatives had 42% of the power, Labour had 31%, and the Liberal Democrats had 15%. And that's, I think, a pretty accurate and interesting reflection. So you could think about what's the balance between there and there. So Labour was twice as influential as the Liberal Democrats, not the same as this score says. And similarly, the Tories were about 3 times more powerful than the Liberal Democrats in that time. Now if we then say, well, who got what in the government, this is from a very interesting paper by Nicholas Allen and some undergraduate students actually at Royal Holloway College, and they added up who got what in the government. So you can see in terms of all government MPs, the Conservatives had 84%, the Liberals 16%. When we think about departmental ministers, it was 82 to 18. When we think about all government posts, 81 to 19. And when we think about cabinet positions, Liberal Democrats did slightly better, 22, 78 for the Tories. And that's incidentally where the power score that I'm advocating would be, just about in the middle here. If we look at total places in the cabinet system, there were quite a lot of Liberal Democrats who were sitting on committees and influencing committee decision-making, including, of course, Nick Clegg, who was not really a departmental minister as Deputy Prime Minister. They also added up the positional power scores for cabinet ministers using an index of mine from 10 years ago. And if you did it on that basis, it was 69 to 31. And actually, if we looked at the popular vote for the government, the Tories had 61% of the overall share, the Liberal Democrats had 39%. And then the coalitionality score, the power index score that we saw, was way off this scale, so perhaps suggesting that it doesn't do very well. Whereas the power score that I'm recommending, I think, gives you a nice prediction of what the balance between the two parties is in terms of the government. And there's another way of looking at that is fairly obvious. I'll leave you to look through that on your own. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope that shows that there are some important ways in which the party system has changed and hasn't changed in 2010.
Right. Thank you, Patrick. I could just get us going, really. What you've described here is a coalition-building arrangement where, in effect, the need to give the minor party something more than it would have got on a straight seat share actually shifted it towards proportionality on vote share. Is that right?
Well, just here, yes. Let's just...
So overrepresented it compared with seats, but still slightly underrepresented compared with
if the Tories and the Liberals had just agreed everything on the basis of their share of MPs, there would have been a 5-6 Tory government all the way through.
Yep.
If they'd agreed it on the basis of their popular share of the votes, it would be a 60-40 split. Actually, they had a range of different things in between these two positions, centering on about a 73-27% split, which is what the power index that I'm recommending predict. So I think that's an interesting thing because it helps you think through how the government has actually operated. The Liberal Democrats made some very strange decisions. They got to have 5 cabinet positions, I think, and one of those is the Deputy Prime Minister, which historically has been a non-job in British politics, given to people like John Prescott and Harriet Harman and people like that. No doubt worthy people, but not, people who are going to rock the aisles with their political wisdom. So Nick Clegg took it mainly because he was going to implement constitutional reform. Sadly, the centrepiece of that was the alternative vote referendum, and then the House of Lords reform, both of which crashed and failed to be implemented. So, in a way, the Liberal Democrats lost out through not taking a ministerial position. So then you had 2 Liberal Democrat ministers that anybody might see on television regularly, Vince Cable at Business and another guy at Energy. And then there was another backroom guy, Danny Alexander, who was mainly doing the incredibly unpopular job of cutting public spending. And finally there was a Scottish secretary that nobody in the UK had ever heard of, least of all in Scotland. So really quite a low-key presence. And the result was that you have a government where 21 of the 23 ministers who count is a Conservative, and the electorate is sort of blaming the Liberal Democrats for sustaining a government. But the club ethos thing did survive. I mean, the passing of the 5-year Parliament Act was a huge sort of joint thing that tied the two together. And so even though the Conservatives campaigned vigorously against the alternative vote, mainly on the grounds that it would give Nick Clegg power beyond his wildest dreams, he'd become a kind of Fu Manchu figure in British politics, and then betrayed the Liberal Democrats on changing the House of Lords, the government has nonetheless survived, and we have these little show pieces where they sort of disagree with each other. But it's been a fantastically coherent government, and it's implemented some very substantial public spending cuts and some quite substantial policy changes.
And the other thing implied by this chart is, of course, it's kept the government at, I think this is the biggest ever payroll vote for the government, isn't it? That number of 119, if it is all of that's the payroll. And that has, presumably, that's been a price of having enough departments and enough ministers to award prizes to a large enough a number of people. But even so, I think a lot of Conservatives feel they are not, it's been a disruptive force within the Conservative Party. Is that true?
Yes, I think that's true. About 30 Tory MPs who might have been ministers are not ministers now because of the coalition.
In minority, they'd have got a job, wouldn't they?
Yes, they would, yeah. And I think that's particularly true of people on the right of the party. Cameron has been... above all, I think what's happened is that Cameron has been a pretty centrist Conservative. Nick Clegg has been a pretty right-wing Liberal Democrat. They've sort of been able to hold the thing together. But you've had 100 MPs really on the Eurosceptic right who are getting more and more dissatisfied as the very long 5-year Parliament has gone on.
It's going to seem longer soon. Chris? Yeah. Chris.
Thank you. So last week we discussed how the share of the vote for the major two parties has declined in the last few decades, and this week we've obviously discussed how party ideas are more eclectic now, and we're sort of converging on the median voter to this catch-all status. Do you think those two things are linked? So would it be fair to say that the parties move to more eclectic thinking, and in that sense, it's meant that they've shot themselves in the foot a bit and as a result seen a declining support base for them?
Well, I think the big thing that was excluded by very managerialist politics was the whole issue of membership of the EU and positions about the EU, and the in the past, in the recent past, let's say in the 2000s, the whole issue about immigration into the UK. So I think the Conservatives were in favour of immigration because that's what business wanted at that time, and they're a pro-business party. Labour was more multicultural and was generally fairly relaxed about immigration rules. And really what happened is that UKIP has mobilised a lot of support. Until the last month or so, we've had, no party MPs who are formally pledged to withdrawing from the EU, even though we've had 1 in 6 British voters supporting that since 2004. So I think going managerialist at just the time when, European and immigration politics were not being combated and not being represented was a major mistake. It's been a real problem for the Labour Party, and it's been a source of real tensions inside the Conservative Party. So I think one of the dangers is if you have an electoral system that insulates parties from public opinion, where large sections of the public can vote for things and then we can just ignore their vote and carry on as if they don't count, they don't win representation in Parliament. Ultimately, you end up with a very stressful political environment. And now I think we're heading into a really, well, we've got into a very polarised Scottish politics. If David Cameron is the Prime Minister still after the next general election, even if he's running a minority government, I think we will head into a very polarised debate about British membership of the EU, and that will be quite energising and non-managerialist. Depending on how the alleged negotiations go and what eventual position the Conservative Party takes, which looks likely as if at least half the party will campaign to withdraw along with UKIP. Meanwhile, Labour, I think, has become more pro-EU than it used to be. And probably if there was a Miliband premiership, you wouldn't have a referendum on the EU. And then the whole question of how long you're going to take to do it. Are you going to take 2 years, which is the original Conservative pledge, or will the whole thing be accelerated? I think it's going to be quite economically destabilising for the UK. People will delay inward investment until a result is achieved. And if the result happens to be a vote to withdraw, I think that would produce very large-scale economic tensions and probably a rerun of the Scottish independence referendum, because they're going to vote to stay in. Possibly London will vote to stay in and Scotland will vote to stay in. The east of England will vote to leave. So I think we're going to have, pretty unhappy people. And remember that referendum decisions, as in Scotland, are very, very potent mobilising decisions. If you're a young British citizen now and the old people vote to leave Europe, bang goes your European citizenship, bang goes your labour market opportunities. There'll be a lot of consequences that flow from the vote. So I think that will be remobilising in some ways. And that partly is a product of you shouldn't really have a parliament that doesn't represent what the public wants. It will be much better to have, much more stable, to have a parliament that accurately represents what the public wants, even if you don't like the views.
I mean, do you think that given that lack of stability, which is self-evident now, I would argue, I think I agree with you, that it's given the Scots, particularly the SNP in government in Holyrood, but potentially with a group of MPs at Westminster, remarkable potential leverage on the Westminster system?
Well, yes and no.
I did say potential.
Yeah. You got to remember the way that the Conservative and Liberal parties handled the Irish, so that for for most of the time they agreed to just ignore the Irish.
You mean back in the
19th century, when the Asquith government became dependent on Irish votes after the second of the 1910 elections, actually British politics was spiralling down towards something close to a civil war in Ireland if the First World War hadn't happened. So there were very many, tensions then as soon as you get a third player involved. And it's difficult, for example, let's suppose Ed Miliband wins enough to be the largest party in Parliament. But then he needs the support of the Liberal Democrats and he needs the support of the SNP. Well, then, he risks alienating English voters if he's seen as being beholden to the Scots, even if Labour and the SNP are fighting tooth and nail, and if Labour has lost 20 seats to the Scottish National Party, he would still be in a difficult position. I do think that Alex Salmond would be the guy to get him out of that, because he's very skilled at coalition politics. But so I think it would be quite a messy situation. We could well have a parliament where we have more or less the same number of Tory and Labour MPs. It depends exactly who's got more. Then we've got maybe 20 Liberal Democrats, 20 SNP MPs holding the balance of power jointly.
That's your excellent
yes.
skills. Okay, up here and then here, yes. But back down here.
Just really following on partly from what Tony Travers is saying, is that I'm just wondering the likelihood of a minority government, and particularly the kind of comments that Alex Salmond's been making. I mean, he's obviously ruled out the Conservatives entirely for obvious Scottish reasons, but he has basically talked about, he keeps on referring to his period, his rather successful period actually, as leader of a minority government in Scotland between 2007 and 2011. And of course, it's quite a good precedent for future, perhaps nationally. After all, the minority government led to a landslide victory, which of course the Scottish political electoral system was meant to avoid. And I'm just wondering whether you think that's, the confidence and supply arrangement. I mean, he did deals on a daily basis with the Tories included in the Scottish Parliament. He got away with it. Particularly with it as tight as it is now. The only other thing I wanted to refer to, and I just wonder why there hasn't been more study of this. When the Liberal Democrats went into coalition with Labour in the Scottish Parliament in '99, they did a lot of homework in advance, including visiting their fellow parties in the European countries to learn the lessons of coalition negotiation. And actually, the coalition negotiations took 2 weeks compared with 3-4 days for the 2010 thing, although David Laws had been involved in the Scottish thing and knew it was better to drag it out. And I mean, a lot was learned and didn't seem to be applied, particularly, if you're 15-16% in the polls, so are the Lib Dems equivalent parties in Europe, you've got to be very careful going into coalition. You tend to get thrashed next time round. If you're a higher percentage, there have been a lot of studies about this, about which I'm sure you know much better than I do. And there is still, I think, we're just still feeling our way in terms of coalition. A bit of a ramble, but
I think you're right, because I think that the Liberal Democrats really underestimated completely the electoral costs of going into coalition with the Conservatives. The voters weren't expecting it. The particular circumstances surrounding it, especially this betrayal of the student fees pledge, was very invidious. If they'd not done that, perhaps things would have been better. But now they're really running neck and neck with the Greens, and they're running at about 1/3 of the support in the polls that they had in 2010. And there's a recent study from the British election study suggests that although the Liberal Democrats have been saying, we're incumbents and so we'll hang on to most of our 57 MPs, actually perhaps they'll only hang on to 20. So that would be a pretty radical price to pay for the 5 years of power. And it would also make it very difficult for them to do a deal, a future deal with the Conservatives, because, you know, if you've got only a few cabinet ministers when you had 57 MPs, you're not going to have any cabinet ministers or anything worth noticing if you've only got 20 MPs. So, you know, it puts a lot of future coalitional things in
Well, the leadership will probably switch left. I mean, Clegg and Alexander would probably go in the event of a battle.
Well, I mean, in some ways that would be a sensible thing. You know, if the Liberals want to re-establish themselves as a centrist party, particularly if they were supporting Miliband with the SNP as well, or, you know, some sort of support arrangement, probably would make sense as a way of rebuilding their centrist appeal. What I find really incredibly hard to understand is how they think they could do another conservative Liberal Democrat deal without being, you know, swallowed up completely. I think they would just disappear. That would be the shortest suicide note in history.
Okay, and question here.
You spoke with some amazement about how in 2010 the Labour Party didn't plan for a coalition government. Do you not think it's possible that there were some influential people within the Labour Party that actively didn't want the government to remain? They wanted to be out of government at this time.
Well, okay, you're running a party, you're in government, you've got like 2-3 years where you can see what the polls are saying. They're not looking very good. You could become resigned to losing office. But then you go out and you fight a really stalwart electoral campaign. You pull back 3%, maybe 4%. Instead of getting down to 26%, you come out at 29%. And you've done all that and you haven't got a single idea what your negotiating plan would be if it's a hung parliament. I still find that, you know, a pretty incredible scenario, but that seems to be the scenario that actually happened.
But was it not perhaps a product of that classic British, and you saw it with the UK government, the Scottish referendum, where they were, you know, theatrically saying we're making no preparations for a yes vote, because in a sense as if by doing that they willed that circumstance into existence. I mean, a kind of it's a product of this sort of system as opposed to a tradition of a system where there is a tradition of coalition building.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. I mean, the one powerful factor that operates in British politics is this fantasy factor where parties go into elections claiming that they're going to win outright. You know, the Liberal Democrats claim they're going to win outright, Labour claims they're going to win outright. It's rather like in the European Parliament elections, the parties will, if there are 10 seats, they'll stand 10 candidates. They need 100% of the vote to elect 10 candidates, but they'll still stand 10 candidates, which actually misinforms voters. So there's a certain sense in which we mustn't admit that we might be in a coalition government. Let's not write anything down. Let's not even discuss it in case it gets leaked. So that's one explanation of why Gordon Brown's government did that. The other one is that they just didn't like the Liberal Democrats. And they, Gordon Brown was a guy who just didn't like Nick Clegg, wouldn't contemplate it, wouldn't let anybody else contemplate it. Seems a sort of slightly juvenile attitude for a professional politician. You know, professional politicians are supposed to work the angles, think about every possibility, be prepared. So I find it really quite extraordinary. And yet when you read Lord Adonis's book, which is, you know, very honestly and frankly written so far as one can tell, that is what was happening. Childish politics. Strange.
And one here. And then we'll just take these two because we're running out of time. But yeah.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. You referred to the elite club and cartel in Oxbridge. Because of that group, is it not possible for England not to be in a democracy unless you come from the eco machine, eco being Eton, Cambridge or Oxbridge? And the reason why it looks like a democracy is because the people who come from there are the only people in a democracy, and the rest of the country are walled out of that experience and legitimate human right. Would you agree there's any danger in that statement being true? Thank you.
Okay, actually do that one first, then we'll do the other one. We've got two more. Nice and short. Yeah, Patrick.
Well, we're living in a bad age for democracy, but I don't like to badmouth, liberal democracies. I mean, I think, Britain is a very vigorous liberal democracy. Of course, it has a problem with overrepresentation of people from Eton, Cambridge and Oxford in the governmental machine, and particularly within the parties, within the judiciary, within the higher civil service and so on. But that's a glitch, really. It's not a detraction from the overall representative quality of government. I mean, if people don't like having, a third of all MPs from one course in Oxford, they can do something about it, which is not vote for their MPs, but they don't really care enough to not vote.
That proves my statement correct.
That doesn't mean it's not a democracy.
No one else has the power to be able to concede to do that, which would be the logical thing to do to the independent ones.
Power is a different thing from being elected and so on. So, a democracy is a complicated thing. It's not just vitiated by a pattern of elite dominance. A pattern of elite dominance applies in every governmental system across the Western and other worlds. So we've got to, just think really what we mean. It's not as democratic as it could be. It's not as democratic as I'd like it to be, but it still basically doesn't vitiate the presence of a degree of electoral competition and a degree of responsiveness to public opinion, which I think we shouldn't undervalue what we've got.
It does beg the question, doesn't it, whether the major parties will think they had better change this. I mean, they could try to change it. They found it very hard to elect or to select even equal numbers of women. That's eluded them. So trying to change the makeup in other ways is also going to be quite hard for them, isn't it? Arguably.
I don't think it's so hard for a party to act in the public interest, but it's very unusual for them to do that. I think the party, improvements in British democracy will occur as and when either the Conservative or the Labour Party concludes that they are better off, for example, with a proportional representation system than with the current voting system. Otherwise, they'll just hang on to it in a pretty self-interested way. That's also not democratic, but it's human nature.
Okay, one more. But have to be very quick because we need to be out of
Could you detail a bit more what this self-interest is? I didn't quite get it because they don't earn that much. They don't have any real respect in the public, and from what you're saying, they seem to have less power over time. So I just didn't quite get what their self-interests are and how they might change in the future.
Yeah, interesting. Well, some people do very well out of it. For example, Tony Blair is a multi-millionaire now. And David Cameron surely will be, and so on. So some people who rise to the very top of the tree do very well. I think, there are other rewards, things like honours. The Liberal Democrats, for example, have more knighthoods amongst their MPs than any other party in the country. The Conservatives give out lots of peerages, and so does Labour, and so on. So there's a pattern. Some people, oddly enough, are interested in politics and find it absorbing and so on. I agree, MPs are not terribly well paid. They're not terribly well respected. I think ministers do better, and some MPs do better, like chairs of select committees do slightly better in terms of public respect.
Do they not perhaps think they can do good? They actually they think, rightly or wrongly, if I get into this position, I will have power to do something which I think is good. So it's sort of altruism, sort of self-regarded altruism of some sort. Is that possible?
I think all MPs tell themselves a story about how they're doing good in the world. It's a question of whether you believe that any rational person could believe the story they're telling them.
Fair point.
So, you can have MPs who are campaigning very vigorously for their constituents, and they're trying hard to, get them reconnected to welfare benefits they've been cut off from, or they're helping them with immigration cases. And yet they will then go out and do things that are party self-interested in a very frank, partisan way. So it's a strange combination of factors. Some people like being photographed, like carrying briefcases down Downing Street and so on. It's a strange mindset, but that's where their bliss point is. So, you know, let's just recognise that it's there.
Okay, well, look, that was great. Thank you very much, Patrick.